There are moments in life when danger does not arrive suddenly, like a storm crashing through the sky, but instead seeps in quietly, almost politely, disguising itself as coincidence, as unease, as a fleeting thought that something is not quite right. It lingers in the background, unnoticed by most, but deeply felt by those who are unfortunate enough to be its target. And for Nancy Grewal, that feeling had begun long before the night her world caught fire. Nancy was not the kind of woman who sought attention, yet somehow, attention found her. At 45, her life followed a routine that was as ordinary as it was exhausting. She worked as a caregiver, spending her days tending to people who had been forgotten by time. Elderly patients who needed help with the simplest of tasks, whose stories often faded mid-sentence, whose eyes carried memories that no one else cared to listen to anymore. Nancy listened. She always listened. There was a quiet strength in her presence, a patience that came not from obligation, but from something deeper, something rooted in her belief that every voice deserved to be heard. But it was not her work that would eventually define her. It was what she chose to do when the day ended. Every evening, after returning to her modest home, Nancy would sit down, place her phone in front of her, and begin to speak. Not casually, not carelessly, but with conviction. Her words were not rehearsed, yet they carried the weight of something carefully considered. She spoke about issues that many avoided: religion, identity, politics, and the uncomfortable intersections where they collided. She spoke with a clarity that made people stop scrolling. She spoke in a way that made people feel something: agreement, anger, discomfort, or even fear. And slowly, people began to notice. At first, the attention came in the form of comments, some praising her courage, others criticizing her bluntness. It was the kind of engagement that any online voice eventually encounters. But over time, the tone began to change, subtly at first, and then with a growing intensity that was impossible to ignore. The messages started appearing late at night, often from accounts that had no names, no history, no identity. The words were simple, yet heavy with intent. Stop talking. Nancy had stared at that first message longer than she cared to admit, not because it frightened her, but because it felt different. It wasn't the careless insult of a stranger hiding behind anonymity. It was deliberate, focused, directed. She had dismissed it. But then came another. You don't understand what you're doing. And then another. This is your last warning. Each message, though sent from a different account, carried the same tone, the same rhythm, the same invisible signature of someone, or perhaps more than one person, who was watching her closely enough to care. One evening, as she sat at her dining table, scrolling through her phone with a slight crease in her brow, her friend Mira watched her in silence for a moment before finally asking, "Why do you keep reading them?" Nancy looked up, her expression calm but distant. Because ignoring something doesn't make it go away. Mira leaned forward, concern evident in her voice. But what if this isn't just online nonsense? What if someone actually means it? Nancy allowed herself a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Then they'll have to do more than type. It was a statement of defiance, one that felt powerful in the moment. But beneath it, buried deep, where even Nancy didn't fully acknowledge it, was a quiet, unsettling awareness that something had shifted. And then, one night, that shift became impossible to deny. The night of the fire began like any other, with a stillness that settled over the neighborhood as the world slowly drifted into sleep. The air was calm, the streets empty, and the silence carried a deceptive sense of peace. Inside her home, Nancy had gone to bed early, her body weighed down by fatigue, her mind finally surrendering to rest after another long day. Outside, however, someone was awake. A figure moved through the shadows with a sense of purpose that suggested this was not their first time doing something like this. There was no hesitation in their steps, no uncertainty in their actions. They approached the house slowly, carefully, as if they had already memorized every detail of the space. A CCTV camera, mounted discreetly across the street, captured the moment. The figure paused at the gate, scanning the surroundings with a quick, practiced glance before reaching into their bag and pulling out a container. The liquid inside sloshed softly as it was poured along the edge of the entrance, spreading in a thin, deliberate line that glistened faintly under the dim streetlight. For a brief moment, everything was still. Then came the spark. The flame caught instantly, as if it had been waiting for permission to exist. And within seconds, it began to spread, climbing the walls with a terrifying hunger, consuming everything in its path with an intensity that felt almost alive. Inside, Nancy woke up. At first, her mind struggled to make sense of what was happening. The air felt thick, heavy, wrong. The smell of smoke invaded her senses, sharp and suffocating, and within seconds, confusion gave way to realization. Fire. Her heart began to race as she stumbled out of bed, her movements unsteady but urgent. The hallway was already filling with smoke, the faint glow of flames visible through the front entrance. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to move, to escape, to survive. By the time she reached the door and forced it open, the heat was unbearable, the fire roaring with a ferocity that left no room for doubt. This was no accident. Neighbors began to gather, their voices overlapping in a chaotic mix of shouts and panic as they rushed to help, throwing water, calling for assistance, doing whatever they could to contain the growing inferno. Nancy stood outside, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her eyes fixed on the flames as they devoured the place she had called home. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. This was no longer about words. This was no longer about opinions. This was real. The police arrived soon after, their presence bringing a sense of order to the chaos, but not the answers Nancy desperately needed. Questions were asked, statements were taken, and when Nancy showed them the messages, the threats that had been building for weeks, the officers exchanged glances that spoke volumes without saying a word. "We'll investigate," one of them assured her, his tone professional but distant. Nancy nodded, but she could feel it. They didn't understand. Not yet. Because to them, it was still just a possibility, a theory, a connection that might or might not exist. But to Nancy, it was already clear. Someone had crossed a line. And once someone crosses that line, they don't stop. Days turned into weeks, and slowly life began to settle into something that resembled normalcy. Though it was a fragile kind of normal, one that felt as though it could shatter at any moment. Nancy returned to work, her routine providing a temporary distraction from the lingering unease that refused to fully leave her. But the feeling never disappeared. It followed her in quiet moments, in the reflection of passing windows, in the sound of footsteps behind her, in the unexplained pauses between ordinary events. And then came the day that would end everything. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind that blends seamlessly into memory without leaving a trace. Nancy was at work, caring for one of her regular clients, moving through her tasks with the practiced ease of someone who had done this countless times before. There was nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, nothing to suggest that anything was about to change. When she stepped outside, it was simply to take a brief moment for herself, a small pause in an otherwise routine day. But sometimes, it is in those ordinary moments that life changes forever. The attack was sudden. There was no warning, no time to react, no chance to understand what was happening. One moment she was standing there, and the next, violence. It came fast, precise, and brutal, the kind of attack that spoke not of impulse but of intent. The force, the speed, the accuracy, it all pointed to something calculated, something planned. Nancy collapsed, the world around her fading into a blur of sound and movement, voices shouting, footsteps rushing, chaos unfolding in every direction. And then, silence. The news spread quickly, as news like this always does. Shock turned into speculation, speculation into theories, and theories into narratives that attempted to make sense of something that refused to be understood. Was it political? Was it personal? Was it connected to the fire? Or was it something else entirely? The questions multiplied, but the answers remained just out of reach. Even those closest to her struggled to understand what had happened. Accusations were made, then withdrawn. Statements were given, then reconsidered. Fear, confusion, and uncertainty created a web of contradictions that only made the truth harder to find. And somewhere within all of it, one question remained, echoing louder than the rest. Who wanted Nancy Grewal silenced so badly that they were willing to destroy everything to make it happen? To this day, the case remains unresolved. No clear answers, no confirmed truth. Only fragments of a story that refuses to come together. And perhaps the most unsettling part of it all is not what we know, but what we don't. Because sometimes, the most dangerous stories are not the ones that end, but the ones that are never allowed to be finished.
And somewhere, in the quiet space between truth and silence, the voice of Nancy Grewal still lingers, not as a memory, but as a question that refuses to be answered.